As we did before, I will introduce the moderator, Thomas Forster, who is also on the faculty in the Food Studies program here at the New School. We're very happy to have him on board. He teaches classes on food policy, advocacy. He's worked for over 20 years in government and non-governmental agencies, precisely to around policy issues, the urban-rural linkages. He's been doing a lot of interesting research and work on the theme. He's been involved with international and national agencies on these issues, and we're very happy that he was able also to involve our students in those activities. His work pedigree is huge. He's the senior advisor for government affairs at School Food Focus, and he was policy director for the Community Food Security Coalition in Washington, and I could go on, but I will have Thomas introduce also the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabio, and it's my pleasure to help moderate what I think will be an exciting panel following in the difficult footsteps of the last panels, especially the last one. And I think as the last was asking this question, which I think still hangs in the air for me, is there a New York cuisine? It was a very animated discussion, and it interests me how the complexity of the culinary world in New York often doesn't meet the complexity of the agricultural side of the same food system. Yeah, in discourse and even in policy and institutions, what we will be talking about is the feeding of New York, and under the hood, in terms of the relationship to what most New Yorkers think every day and eat every day about. They probably don't know as much about how the city is fed. And we have a very interesting panel here that represents a number of different perspectives that are actually not only sectors, but different perspectives on the future of food. And I have to say, from the work that I do, and I'm now teaching a course here on feeding cities, policy and governance, and there are students of the class who are here, thankfully, to keep me on board. And that class moves across a number of different levels of current developments. There's a lot going on in New York City, and we're going to hear about that. There's a lot going on in the region. There's actually a lot going on nationally in the rethinking of the food supply of cities and the regional relationship of the food supply to cities. So as we heard a lot about the food landscape of New York being so diverse from so many places, we also know that there's a thriving local food farm-to-table movement in the restaurant field, and some of our panelists are actually coming out of parts of that work. However, there's a bigger than just local food and agriculture conversation when it comes to the feeding of cities. And as you heard, I work at several different levels, and one of them now that's actually quite an intellectual climate of excitement is the future of how cities and agriculture, or food in cities, will meet. Under the threats of climate change, we have a lot, even before the California drought took the news again, a lot going on about rethinking the sourcing of food for large and small cities. And that's actually entered into the debate around the future of a development agenda, or the future of goals, targets, metrics, and indicators that's ongoing up just a few blocks from here right now. And I'm also working with a group of 36 cities from every continent who are working on a common urban food policy pact. And by October, in Milan, Italy, there will be a gathering of mayors. It's still a question whether the New York mayor, de Blasio, will be there. He is going to the Milan Expo, but whether he'll be there for the signing of the Pact on World Food Day. October 16th is still a question. Anyway, I'm going to pose a question that's actually being posed on Wednesday in a UN meeting on the future of cities in Nairobi, Africa. And basically the question is, since the food that feeds cities is mostly grown in rural areas, and the processing and marketing and consumption mostly happens in urban areas, and the infrastructure that connects those areas is either in need of reinvestment or retooling, especially in light of some of these big economic and environmental pressures. How can really the world of cities and their territories or regions move together towards a more integrated public and private investment in the infrastructure that connects? And the infrastructure is not just the hard infrastructure we hear about in resiliency planning and discourse. It's also soft infrastructure, but it's not just the softness of oyster beds. Karen is an oyster farmer, so I used oysters as the example. But it's also the soft infrastructure of people, institutions, and policies. And so today we're going to actually cut across, but starting with perhaps the most fundamental. We're not going to start here, but it starts in a conceptual sense with the land. It's really the source of our provision of food, whether it's hydroponic, vertically grown, or more commonly in the soil. And then the people, the institutions, the markets. I'm going to start with a short introduction of Karen. We're going to have a format that's slightly different here in that we have 4 really exciting short presentations. Within 5 to 7 minutes, we will have those presentations one after the other, assuming we won't have any technological difficulties. And then we'll have a round or two of questions that are triggered by the comments amongst the panelists, and then throw it open for discussion. This is cutting edge discourse. You know, it's really young. There's not been a long history of the rethinking of how cities are fed in a systemic way that includes planning, health, logistics, electeds at all levels, the nonprofit community, the food justice community. There's no one who isn't at the table in some way or another. But why is Rural Urban Nexus appended to the title of this panel? This is, I'm not going to go into the weeds on this, but the Rural Urban Nexus is now the way in which the future of urban sustainability is being framed at the most international level. You can't have sustainable cities without the rural landscapes that sustain cities. I'll just stop there because it's a lot more involved in that, but we're going to get into the panel now. And I'm going to start with Karen. Karen Karp is the founder and director of the Karp Resources, which is a small but catalytic consulting firm that works in New York and in many other communities, and is really very entrepreneurial in one respect, that it's a consultancy that is tracking in a very nuts and bolts way where the infrastructure needs are going to be. As a client of government, as a client of foundations, as a client of nonprofits, it's really a trend mapping, pragmatic nuts and bolts kind of work that Karen's been doing for years, and she's going to give you a very quick overview of the work that she's been doing over the last years. And I think this will kind of set the New York City stage, and then we'll move into other dimensions afterwards.
Catalytic is a really nice compliment. I'm not sure if I or we deserve it, but the moment that we are experiencing right now with regard to cities being developed around a healthy, sustainable, local food value proposition is we are definitely in a very catalytic time. And my presentation is not really a presentation, it's really kind of like 8 or so slides that illustrate just in the last, well, starting back in 1976, but then jumping to 2002, from 2002 until today, a little bit of a progression to show through the kind of lens of the work that we've been doing, and a couple of other things, how the sort of mindset about identifying where our food comes from, who gets that food, what quality is it, who wants to buy it, who wants to eat it, and what is getting in the way. That's one way to kind of summarize a huge amount of the work that we've been doing over the last 25 years, but in terms of the rural urban nexus, the last 15 years. This picture here is a picture of the old Washington Street Market. And this picture was taken in the mid to late 1920s, and you could consider this a farmer's market. And why could you consider it a farmer's market? Well, everybody that's there is there on a horse and buggy or a car or a small truck, so they couldn't have come from very far. And in fact, in this farmer's market, farmers were still coming from Upper Manhattan, they were coming from the Bronx, they were coming from Long Island. Brooklyn at the time was still largely agricultural. And this market was a wholesale market. So it's a farmer's market, but at the wholesale level, which means that these guys were bringing in their wares from anywhere from maybe 3 to 50 miles, 60 miles from New York City, and selling them to jobbers or retailers or restaurateurs, probably even schools and other kinds of institutions, in a very normal way of food transaction that we think of today one-on-one for ourselves. I want to go to a farmer's market, I'm going to join a CSA, I'm going to get my food directly from the supplier. In New York City, as in many other cities around the country and the world, at this point, 100 years ago, a century ago, this was normal. Producers bringing their products into a city and selling them directly to the buyers who would then transform the food into what you and I would be eating every day, and everybody else would be eating every day. So just a little bit of context. That's kind of where this whole picture starts. And this picture continued on like this for a while. There were more trucks, they got bigger trucks, they got even bigger trucks, the farmers were further away, they brought in more food, it got really crowded. Anybody who has lived in New York City for a long time probably still remembers the Washington Street Market. And in 1967, New York City built the Hunts Point Produce Terminal Market up in the Bronx, which was the first market built to handle wholesale quantities of food, local and otherwise. But by the 1960s, most of the food in New York City's food shed, our food shed, very large. A lot of mouths, a lot of eaters. Here in New York City, a lot of places have supplied New York City, and the food shed, as it is technically known, the technical definition, and Steve will give you another technical definition of a food shed, means the tentacles by which any particular place reaches out to acquire food for its citizens. So we are in a global marketplace, and the local marketplace is really important, and it's been growing in importance. And I'm just going to show you a few slides to tell you how it's kind of, it went backwards a little bit, and now it's coming forwards. Okay. In 1976, Green Market was founded. Contrary to what a lot of people know and believe, the first Green Market was not at Union Square. It was on a corner of 2nd or 3rd Avenue and 53rd Street or something like that. And it was a big challenge. But there were 2 real champions that got it through and to the Parks Department to create a partnership, which then brought it down to Union Square Park. And now we have about 60 Green Markets and 100-something other farmers markets that are not run by Green Market in and around New York City. I'm skipping ahead because my consciousness around this did not really kick in until 2002, even though I've been working in the food business my entire professional career, which is longer than I want to admit. But around 2002, a bunch of things were happening. There was Hilary Baum produced a conference called the Baum Forum. That later turned into an organization called the Food Systems Network of New York City, which continued to bring awareness and thoughtfulness and coming together of minds and intellect and emotion and practice around what is our food system and how can it be better overall, not just around local food, but healthy food, et cetera. And I suppose one measure of success after all these years is that the Food Systems Network of New York City doesn't exist anymore as of January, right? It doesn't exist, partly because Hillary got tired, and partly because there's so much going on now that the momentum, they were catalytic. They were catalytic in getting this whole local food, urban, rural nexus started. Okay. In 2002, the New York State Department of Ag and Markets issued an RFP for for a consultant to look at studying the potential for reestablishing a wholesale farmers market. Remember Washington Street Market? That was a wholesale farmers market. And I applied for it in partnership with somebody else, and we won. And we determined in that first phase of the study that there was 10 times the demand for local food among restaurants, retailers, distributors than there was current available supply. And that demand was $1 billion in 2004 when the report was published. 1 billion. We did a second round of work for the department to say, okay, there seems to be momentum for this wholesale farmers market, where should we put it? So we went around and we interviewed lots of people again, and we looked at Hunts Point, and we looked at Brooklyn and other places in the Bronx and Manhattan, et cetera, and we gave our recommendation to the governor of New York, who was Eliot Spitzer at the time, and he was convinced. He said, this is amazing, it's $1 billion now, and we only have 20% of supply, so this is an upstate, downstate opportunity. Let's invest in agriculture, let's invest in infrastructure in New York, let's make this thing happen. It was 1 week before he left office. He had $57 million in the state budget to build a wholesale farmers market. And a week later, he was out of a job, and that money just, who knows how it was spent? Nobody really knows. In 2007, so those two studies were 2004 and 2006 is when they were published. In 2007, the city of New York established a position called the New York City Food Policy Coordinator. The first coordinator was Ben Thomasis, and he was very excited about focusing on the intersection of economic development and health and food access. And under his tenure as Food Policy Coordinator of New York City, we got the FRESH program, which is about reestablishing and rebuilding supermarkets in low-income communities. We got the New York City Green Cart Initiative, which my organization supported for 5 years, which is 1,000 permits created specially for the sale of fruits and vegetables in low-income communities. Later, if somebody grabs me, I'll tell you how I was advocated to have a certain percentage of that be local food, which was completely not possible for all sorts of reasons and not even the point of the program. In 2010, Kim Kessler took over from Ben, and her focus was, again, on food access and hunger and very, very intricate community-based programs, not so much focusing on local food, just like Ben's focus was not so much on local food. And last year, we now have a food policy director. So it's a bigger status position. There is a second person in that office. Barbara Turk works very closely with the mayor and his direct reports, as well as reports to the deputy mayor of Health and Human Services. And Barbara's work is encompassing the whole food system. So she's taking a look at improving health and health outcomes by virtue of getting healthier food in the places that need it, both the neighborhoods and the schools and the institutions. She's looking at, specifically at, and Steve will speak to this more, about New York City's self-interest in investing in rural places so that we have food when we need it, and the food we want, fresher, healthier, more local food, grown by farmers that we can identify and feel like we are supporting in an exchange of local economy. So we're in a really, really, really good place now because we have more political support at the top levels in New York City. Stepping back a few minutes, a few years, just because some things overlap. Between between 2006 and 2009, we were asked to help a multi-agency strategy called School Food Plus support New York City schools to buy local food. So we went into a broker role. We said, okay, we need to get the products in there. How are we going to do it? And we designed a strategy that aligned school foods purchasing with products that are grown and produced in New York State, and we created a prioritization, and we said 10 products, we're going to focus on 10 products, and within 2.5 years, we got $5 million of locally produced food, vegetables, fruits, yogurt, processed carrots, and some other things into New York City schools with no impact on their budget. Same money, which at the time was like $1.76 for meals, something like that, for food. So that work continues now. New York City Schools has a bigger strategy now than they did then, and they are working on it. In 2008, Green Market took over the wholesale farmer. So that, remember that first picture? That first picture became something else up in the Bronx called the Bronx Terminal Market. And then those farmers there was a diaspora when the city redeveloped the Bronx Terminal Market to be a mall. All the vendors in the market and all of the farmers who were selling out of their trucks in a parking lot were dispersed among the city. And Green Market brought them back together and found a location for them in the Bronx, not far from the produce market, to sell their food. They're now currently selling out of the parking lot of Restaurant Depot and Jetro, still in the Hunts Point section of the Bronx. But Green Market said, okay, the state's kind of not taking care of this, we're gonna pay attention to it. 2010, the New York City Foodworks platform, Christine Quinn's 107-page, 56 pieces of legislations document came out. I was a member of that team. We focused on these 5 areas. So now we're taking really very much of an entire system approach to the kind of food we want, looking at the major areas where food needs support, legislation, investment, and interest to build a robust food system in New York City. Current initiatives among dozens or hundreds of them. I just put a couple of things in here to show you. There's so many, it would take up 10 slides to show you all the initiatives that are going on in New York City right now. But the one I would like you to pay attention to a little bit is this Seal of New York up here, DCAS, Department of Central Administrative Services. Based on the outcome of the Foodworks plan and local law 52 and 50, New York City agencies now are allowed to spend 10% more to purchase local food. How much more local food are they purchasing? Not nearly as much as they could. Why? The supply is not there. It's not there in the form that they want it. And they don't even understand how they would be able to go about getting it, although there is great intentionality, and it's one thing that Barbara in the Food Policy Office is really working very hard on. And so I'm expecting to see lots of progress there. In 2011, Columbia University Earth Institute did a food shed study. This is a very famous map that came out of that, looking at what do we consider New York City's local food shed. And again, I'm leading into Steve here, so I'm going to not say more about that because he's going to say a lot. And leading up to today, literally an hour ago, I was interviewing Steve, who I've known for a while anyway, so it was kind of silly that I was interviewing you. But Governor Cuomo, at the end of 2014, set up a New York City, New York State Food Hubs Task Force, made up of an unprecedented combination of state and city agencies working together for the very first time in my lifetime, which is a half a century plus, on this issue of how are we going to meet the demand for local food and stimulate farm economy, food economy, create jobs, create more equity in the access to healthy food. And we have 90 days, we're now supporting this Food Hubs Task Force, which is made up of the governor's office, the mayor's office, Empire State Development Corp., New York City Department of Economic Development, and New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. So they all got put together and said, you guys got to play nice now. And I want an answer in 90 days, which will be sometime in June, to what is going to solve this problem.
of meeting the demand for local food, and what problems exactly are we solving by doing it. So that's the intro. I went 3 minutes over, I'm sorry. I said I was going to be good, but questions will come later, I'm sure. Yeah.
That was fabulous, and it was too rich not to let you finish. We have just heard a lot about the soft infrastructure that I was referring to. This sequence of developments are really more institutional and policy intertwined with good people in staff and elected positions that create the political will to actually start to move the kinds of investments that we're going to hear more about from our other speakers. What's interesting about New York's current moment, I'll just say, and this is coming up in the global conversation of cities about this very need for the integration of urban and rural planning between the demand side and the supply side and the in-between infrastructure investments that are needed. Where are the farmers? Where is the NGO world? Where are the civil society actors, including the most vulnerable, in these processes? There's some very creative answers. New York's lagging on this one and has to, I think, pay attention to some of the other cities that are developing parallel structures in civil society, and this it's not that hasn't been part of the conversation. We just haven't figured it out in our very complex, somewhat fractious, very diverse landscape of organizations in the food movements that want to be part of this, that want to give input to it. So I'll just put that on the table because I think it's a future topic. It's one that perhaps some of the others can actually in their remarks touch on as well. So we're going to go upriver, and upstream is to the land. And the next presentation by Steve Rosenberg, who's the director of Scenic Hudson, has been, as long as Karen's been involved, he's been involved in the protection of farmland. And one of the things that's very interesting about those NGOs or nonprofits that have been involved in farmland protection is just in the last decade, they've really shifted towards the food security-based farmland protection, I would say. You can contradict me. Maybe Scenic Hudson's been at this for much longer, but nationally, the conservation movement around farmland protection has been motivated by other values, not lesser values, but other values. So I would say, Steve represents the importance of land mattering, and that when you see the political leadership for the infrastructure investment that is aggregation or distribution, storage, processing, and the movement logistically of food from point A to B, you need a parallel investment in the land base. And it's not just the land, it's also in the farmers. And we'll get to that with Beth.
Thank you, Thomas. It's great to be here. And Thomas, thank you for organizing the panel, including me on it, and especially organizing it around the principle of this nexus between urban and rural, the city and the surrounding countryside, because I think that is, at least in terms of what I'm going to be speaking about, what it's all about that relationship between New York City in this case and the surrounding region. And for me, it's about the Hudson Valley region and thinking about that as a central feature of the city's regional food shed. And the concept of food shed, which Karen mentioned before, I always think it's important to point out, isn't something that even Karen or I, who've been at this for a while, thought up. But it actually goes back to the 1920s, and a Port Authority economist named Walter Hedden wrote a book called How Great Cities Are Fed, and developed the concept of the food shed, which was then and is now about the relationship between where a population center is located and the places from where it secures its food. This map, I'll just point out, those dots, each one of those dots is a farm that sells into New York City green markets. And of course, there are lots of different ways that food makes its way into the city and lots of outlets, but it's, I think, illustrative of the number and concentration of farms located in the Hudson Valley that are developing and supporting that relationship that I mentioned. The Hudson Valley for many years has been seen as New York City's lungs, you know, for people who want to go out and get rejuvenated and hike in the Hudson Highlands and get respite from the stress of the city. Certainly the city's been investing in protecting its supply of local water, of clean water, by protecting the land surrounding its reservoirs for more than 20 years now, investing hundreds of millions of dollars over that time. And now, of course, we're thinking about the Hudson Valley and the surrounding region as New York City's great green garden, the place from which, if we want the city and the region to have access to fresh local and regional food, this, of course, is the place where it comes from. And so we've begun to think about it, the farms and the farmland in this region, as a singular resource, not as an apple farm here and a dairy over there and an orchard over here and a row crop farm over there, but an assemblage of farmland and agricultural resources that must be in place if we want this relationship to continue. When we protect farmland, and I'll talk in a minute about that, we also achieve a number of other public benefits. We're protecting wildlife habitat. A lot of the farms are not just productive farmland, but also streams and wetlands and steep slopes and forests. We're protecting water quality because there are aquifers and water recharge areas. The soils, of course, are incredibly important to protect. And we're also reducing the city's food print to the extent that food is being brought into the city from 50 or 100 miles away in an efficient manner. It's a whole lot less intensive a carbon impact than if you're importing food from across the world. When I think about a sustainable regional food system, I think about a number of elements that need to be functioning well and in a coordinated manner, and they all need to be happening at the same time. For a number of years, and I think Thomas alluded to this and Karen as well, there was a bit of a struggle between the agricultural community that was focused on agricultural economic viability, making sure tax policy was supportive of farmers and that local farmers could compete effectively with Washington state apples or produce from China. And then there were the conservationists, and this is what Thomas was talking about, who at least were perceived as wanting to just get their hands on the farmland and lock it up. And over time, as public interest in fresh local food has evolved and our understanding of regional food systems has evolved, there's a greater coming together between the conservation community and the agricultural community and the agribusiness community to understand that we need a secure land base and all that that brings as the underpinning, the fundamental underpinning, in order to make sure we can have local and regional agriculture. And those people who are working to conserve the land also need to understand and be supportive of all of these other policy matters and processing and distribution and access issues and food security issues that Thomas mentioned, if we're going to have a complete and sustainable regional food system. Of course, and Thomas mentioned this as well, and it goes really to the relationships of city and rural, it's essential to think about the regional food shed in the context of what's happening right in the city. Urban agriculture is not insignificant. It's not insignificant to the people who are engaged in it through job training and access to skills and access to fresh food and bringing a sense of community together. And also from this sense of land security. When a community garden is threatened in New York City, it's really, in my mind, no different than a farm being proposed to be subdivided into 100 house lots up in Columbia County. So we need to have this relationship strengthened between urban agriculture and regional agriculture, and we need investments in the infrastructure that will support urban agriculture, just like we need the investments in conserving the regional agricultural land base that is necessary to produce food at that scale. Outside, I'll make a little plug, there are various documents which I've put on the table, and one of them is an op-ed piece that urban farmer Karen Washington and I co-authored about that relationship between the urban food shed and the regional food shed. So what are the mechanics? How does this happen on the ground? I like to say, if demand alone were enough to keep farmland as farmland, then the Bronx and Westchester would still have a lot more farms there than they do today. But real estate pressure and real estate dynamics ultimately will always trump agriculture as a land use unless something proactive is done to conserve the farmland. So the mechanism is called the purchase of development rights, and basically a farm family is paid for the amount by which a permanent restriction on their farmland reduces the value of that property, and then they can do whatever they want with that money, and they can invest in buying new land, making their farm more efficient, investing in equipment, or investing in their family's future. To date, Scenic Hudson's projects alone have put $40 million into local farm families' hands to invest in the productive capacity of their farms, which has helped to grow the supply and resiliency of agriculture in the region. We've done this on what we call a critical mass strategy, where instead of protecting a farm here and a farm there, we protect a group of farms altogether. And it creates a bulwark or a defense against all of these pressures working against local farming. Well, as we've been doing this over the last 17 years, and the public interest in fresh local food in the city and the region has been growing, the concept sort of started to develop of thinking about, as I said before, the agricultural land base as a singular resource, the food shed as a single unit, and what would be needed to conserve it as a critical mass of farmland in place to supply the city and the region with food. So we developed a food shed conservation plan, a GIS-based, database document that looks at soil quality, farm size, and how the collection of the highest priority farms are organized across the region, so that when policymakers are thinking about making investments in conserving the food shed, there's an objective strategic document against which decisions and priorities can be made. We learned that there are about 5,000 farms, almost 650,000 acres at risk in the Hudson Valley alone, unprotected. Only 11% of the farmland in the Hudson Valley Regional Food Shed has been conserved to date. So what are we going to do about it? If we wanted to conserve together all of the stakeholders, New York State, and we've got to commend the governor and the state legislature for just approving $20 million to protect farmland in the Hudson Valley, which is going to be tremendously beneficial to New York City and the region. But all of the stakeholders need to be involved. The philanthropic community, the state, the federal government has a program, organizations like ours, impact investors, and New York City. So what will success look like? If we can develop a robust and reliable stream of funding so that farm families can partner with conservation organizations and conserve a critical mass of the region's food shed with the investment of all of the key stakeholders, including New York City, which has invested tremendously to conserve its access to water. If only the city would do the same thing as part of a progressive food policy to conserve its access to fresh local food. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was fabulous. And I don't know how many of you realize how wonderful, I mean, this timing for the two presentations we just had, one from the urban, one from the regional, state level. It's never been the way it is right now. And making hay while the sun shines is really important, because there's some other forces at work which are dark clouds. I would call these the rays of sunshine we're hearing about today. And I think the fact that the city, with its latest director of food policy, is, as she told me, and she, by the way, will be here tomorrow in a different panel on the power of the public plate, which is talking about public sector investment at all levels in agriculture that meets private, but it's about the public plate. But she said this administration doesn't want pilot projects. They want to just do it. Just do it, and that was music. I don't know if she said this to you too, because you're working with her more closely, but it is fabulous to hear that from someone in a position such as that. And frankly, there are other people like that. She's not a lone wolf, as it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. People that progressive were lone wolves. Mostly women too, but mostly lone wolves. And now I think it's the next panelist that provides maybe the most critical ingredient to making this work, which is farmers matter. Farmers matter. And as we heard, and actually very well articulated perspective that links the urban food producer, whether they're called a gardener or an urban farmer, to the rural food producer. This is actually one of the ways that cities are beginning to know their farmers. And New York has a lot of case history around that. But there are, as we've heard, farming regions that are not in the Hudson Valley, that are producing at scale and volumes that New York needs. It's what our friends in one of the Rome-based food agencies, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, calls the remote rural. The remote rural has to be included in the Rural Urban Nexus. And the remote, for us, could be in New York as far as California, but it could also be the large-scale food production in central New York, or the myriad smaller and often struggling dairy farms of the Catskills. Our next speaker actually comes with a bona fide pedigree of urban-rural planning, so she has for many years been in that urban-rural linkage from a planning perspective first as she went through her schooling, but then becoming the Economic Development Director for Cornell Extension in Madison County, which is in the heart of that central New York large-scale growing area. And then from there to the Catskills on the just over the hills from the Hudson Valley, working in the Watershed Ag Council, which is actually a very important world-class example of rural-urban linkages, where a city budget actually supports farmers' good farming practices in order, in this case, to preserve and protect the water supply of a city. It's not a small investment in a region of poor farmers. It's not always just about farming. But what we're going to, I'm also, by the way, proud to say that Beth is my new daughter-in-law. And I did not screen her before her marriage on whether she had the rural urban interest that she does have.
Thomas, sure.
Oh, sure. Anyway, I just had to throw that out. So we're going to start with, you can come up and hit the play button. We're going to start with a short video. I should say at the last moment, not last, but the next moment, Beth has come to the city and is the sourcing manager for Blue Apron. And just one more word here for those who are the culinary artists and professionals in the audience. One of the interesting things about the New School is this close connection between the culinary world and the food and farming world, whether it's urban agriculture or agriculture at a larger scale. And what Beth represents is actually a marriage of these two worlds, and I think there are going to be more and more of these crossover professionals who are working with the cutting edge trends of food and culinary taste, whether we can define New York cuisine, and the agricultural capacity that is needed. So it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. If I can be honest, it's great to take a break from building the Rural Urban Nexus and to talk about it for a minute, because it's a pretty uphill battle, which I'll get into later. Just briefly, in case anyone's not familiar with what Blue Apron is, we are a e-commerce food retail business based here in New York City, but also operating outside of San Francisco. We are currently putting out 1 million meals a month to consumers. Our motto, the mission of our company, really is to make cooking accessible to everybody. So even though it comes in a food or comes in a box directly to consumer, the price is not averages about $9.99 per person per meal. So it's not something that is not accessible to everybody. And so, like Thomas mentioned, my job is to really make sure is to build the supply chains that puts food directly from farms in those boxes. So on that note, I'm going to show a short video that highlights one of the farms that I've been working with recently.
The soil's a lot more grateful than we think. You give it something, it'll give it back to you manyfold. My name's Tony Serrano. I'm the general manager for Interrupción, California. We focus on fair trade and really the well-being of our growers and employees.
Soy Ramón Flores, estamos en Madera, California. Aquí atrás de mí están mis plantas, es una operación de nombre Bompack.
The way we help small farmers is via connecting them with customers like Blue Apron. We focus on crop planning, technical support, business planning, finance. So we try and cover all aspects along with organic certification, food safety, and currently fair trade.
Primero, como amigos, me conectó con Interrupción para vender mis white turnips. Me platicó de que pueden ayudarme a vender muchos más productos de los que yo tengo, entonces me gustó mucho porque es para familias. Yo quisiera que mi producto saliera del campo directamente a las familias donde va a ser consumido.
So Ramon is one of those people that really takes pride in what he does. He believes in the product he grows, eats it, feeds his family with it, and more than anything wants to continue agriculture.
Cuando nosotros migramos de México a Estados Unidos, aquí nosotros llegamos y el trabajo más honesto se nos hace del campo. Donde se esté consumiendo, me hace sentir con confianza, me hace sentir seguro que están comiendo algo saludable y orgánico. Son productos que son nada más de pura tierra y agua. Eso fue lo mejor que me gustó porque primero es todo lo que consumimos yo y mi familia.
So that's a snapshot of some of the farms that we work with. So that's Ramon, who's farms north of Fresno in California. We don't need to watch Tim's carrot demo, unless somebody really wants to. So getting back to the subject at hand, as I indicated in the beginning, I am actively working to create supply chains that bring food from rural areas to our fulfillment centers where we put food and deliver it to consumers across the country. And like I said, we're delivering approximately 1 million meals a month at this point. And so as someone who is, so I thought what I would do today, rather than kind of focusing on the theoretical side of this conversation, really kind of give you guys a snapshot of what it is like to actually be involved in building these supply chains. And I thought I would really focus on New York City, given the topic of today's panel. And so I would like to give a bit of a state of the food shed from my perspective as someone who's really on the ground trying to build these supply chains. And so I would say, despite being someone who, for the reasons that we've seen today, is making hay when the sun is shining, as Thomas indicated earlier, I would have to say that the state of the food shed from my perspective is one of jaded optimism. And I'll explain a little bit why I feel that way. So, as you've seen in this panel, and I'm sure you've also learned through other explorations around this topic, despite the state and federal funding investments in farms, food hubs, and related businesses and services, despite the increased activity around agriculture to support agriculture by both private actors, nonprofits, government agencies, which as Thomas mentioned, I was definitely part of that movement earlier. Despite increased, basically insatiable consumer demand for local food in New York City, as some of Karen's studies have shown, despite the recent technical innovations, what Blue Apron could fall into one of those, given the way our model works and the way we get food out to consumers. despite the increase in urban agriculture acreage, despite the number of new farmers entering farming. So despite all this activity in this local food space, as someone who's on the ground and trying to get more local food to people in a city across the country on a daily basis, it is still incredibly challenging. And the challenges are many and they're complicated. The volumes are not there in the Northeast. We do not have enough soft or hard infrastructure. And the one I would particularly highlight around that is post-harvest handling. It's amazing how many products, even from experienced farms, are still coming in at the wrong temperature, not packed correctly, not cooled correctly, things like that. As I'm sure we're all familiar with, access to land, labor, and capital is really challenging for both new, both new and long-term farming. Labor is a huge issue across the country for farms. Whenever I ask farms, what's your number one problem? They say marketing and labor. And at Blue Apron, I can take care of the marketing problem because they don't have to market to us. We just buy the food, but I can't solve the labor problem. So I think there's been, despite the huge development of food hubs and related businesses and other support services in recent history, there's still several challenges. I think the lack of information infrastructure is one of the ones that I think is one of the lowest pieces of lowest hanging fruit. Just more intelligence and easier access to what farms are growing and when they have it and where they're located. So I guess, just to get back to the original question, which is how can we create these city region food systems, regional food systems, however you want to describe it. I would say that we really need to stop trying to make the existing dominant conventional supply chain work for farms and really rethink that supply chain and create farm-centric supply chains, which is not going to look like, food hubs necessarily, where we're just trying to make the existing conventional supply chain more farm-friendly. We really need to create these farm-centric systems. So rather than taking a list of products that schools like to purchase from farmers, go and asking what the farmers would like to supply, go to the farmers and ask them what they can supply. And that's just a simple example of a way we just I think we really need to shift our thinking about how we approach these problems so we really can move this movement forward. Obviously the labor is a problem that I think would greatly alleviate a lot of these problems. So I think that just to end on on a slightly more positive note, I really mean that it's despite all these issues, I really meant it when I said this is a moment for myself of jaded optimism, where I was able to go to Ramon's farm and buy him out of 3 different crops, given our volumes, which was a real success story. And so I think that the optimism part is definitely there, and we're definitely seeing a lot of movement in the right direction. I think that if all the land agencies, if all the agencies can just do more, collaborate more, all of the policy, the land, the capital, if we just can find ways to get out of our silos and work together more closely, we can, and while keeping the farm at the center, we can make more progress. So I'll end there until later.
I like that, a healthy dose of jaded optimism. I think of that. I think that's actually a very, very well coined term, and I think this is exactly why we wanted to have you here, because there is a huge number of challenges. You mentioned 4 very, very particular ones that are each very complicated. I think the jaded optimism partly comes, or the jading part of the optimism, it comes also from a learning curve amongst many of the perceived agents of change, self-perceived nonprofits, and even some of the new entries into food work at local government levels who just don't understand partly these challenges from the ground up, and also the complexity of the food system as it is today. Even this mentioned new food hub movement, which New York State has jumped on the wagon along with many other parts of the U.S., which is a new kind of approach to food aggregation, distribution with more services for the farmer, like food safety, business planning, market access training as part of that service. At one point, not too many years ago, it was a big question whether what was being done here was to try to create a parallel food distribution system to the existing one, or whether it was providing new services to the existing conventional, mostly governed the transactional system where food is passed from buyer to seller based on mostly price and quality and grading standards imposed from wherever, government or the market. So I think this has really been a good set of perspectives for our next speaker, who I've come to learn from in the last couple of days brings a really valuable example of what having someone who's not doing their daily work in New York, but in another part of the world where they're grappling with many of the same problems, but in different cultural, political, and economic and social contexts. In learning a little bit about what Maurizio Mariani does, he spoke about avoiding fundamentalisms. And I just thought of that again, because I think part of the jaded comes from also a different source, which is over-enthusiasm and a lot of talk for a lot of years and not a lot of action in any volume. And that's been the case in the food movement work of the US. And it was even the case in the early years of the organic movement, where it was thought that things would really shift, and they didn't, and labor was too hard to include in organics at first. And anyway, the complexity of all this work is not there for many newcomers. But Maurizio, actually, I would say the two words that depict his perspective being brought here is that convening matters. Convening matters, and that bringing the private sector in early and strategically matters. And of course, Karen works in this environment as well, and I'm sure all of the panelists on some level.
And sometimes we work together.
And we work together, right. In fact, they're both, Karen and Maurizio, graduates of a wonderful program called the Sustainable Food Lab, which is really an experimental and convening ground around transformative sustainability agendas in food companies that's been running for years. But Maurizio is a successful businessman who's turned his success back into the research and development on the sustainability transformations of businesses in food in Europe, primarily, but not just in Europe. And he's been a food service professional, even in charge of the Compass Italy account, as I understand, at one time, and working in food service for years to the point where he understands it so well that he's actually able to help kind of reimagine the food service of the future in a way that solves some problems that he'll probably refer to. He's a consultant to business, to government. He does that through a really marvelous consortium, partly funded by foundations, partly funded by the private sector, called Risteco. And Risteco also has a project called Eating City that he'll tell you about. So without further ado, Maurizio, please join the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. I try, to connect some dots, because the previous intervention, there was quite a representation of all the chain, production, project design with Karen, and e-commerce, and organic production in a fair trade way with the last one. And this is the cover of my last book that is titled City Food Policy, Securing Our Daily Bread in an Urbanizing World, because one of the main challenge we need to face in the years coming is that a lot of people will come to live in a big city. So we will have a really we need, as we always say, a shift of paradigm into our food service. So, and of course my intervention, my speech is related to the European situation, much more than the US one, but I remember several years ago we were with Karen together in Sustainable Food Lab annual meeting in Portland, and we were talking about metric system, because to evaluate what's sustainable and what's not sustainable, we need to evaluate, we need to establish a common metric system, and it will be quite difficult to have only one metric system worldwide, because each continent is different from the other one. And also because food is identity of the territory, tradition, religion. So there is so many facts that are impacting our daily food that we were all convinced, and we are more than 100 people experts in food service talking about this metric system. And we were all agreed that we should have some indicators, common indicators worldwide, but each continent must have its own evaluation system and metric system. Anyway, from the experience of the Eating City platform that we manage from almost 5 years, and we create a lot of workshops around the world, from China, from European, from Africa, we decided to write this book and to give some bullet points, some idea to really go beyond. First is territorial and institutional tools. We are talking about food policy, city food policy, but we need also to be connected to regional level and continental level, because otherwise we will have too much localism. It should be dangerous, believe me. We are in a globalized world. We cannot become local, and local. We need to be connected. City, regional, and continental level are the right level to talk about food policy, and really to create a system that is creating a better integration between production, distribution, and consumption. Another key word is urban planning. When we will have to face this big flow of people coming from rural, living to the city, we account around today 50% of the world is living in a big city. In the year 2030, 2050, 70% of the people will live in an urban context. So we need to redefine the boundary of the city. We need to redefine the relation between urban and rural. We identify the public food service, so it means the school canteen, the hospital, the arms. Any kind of food service is bought by public body and local authorities as a big lever to help the needed shift of paradigm. But why we need a shift of paradigm? In the world, it's very nice, because in the industrialized country, we are wasting a lot of food. In Europe, we produce for each European citizen 900 kilos of food, but I am not able to eat 900 kilos of food per year. Believe me, it's impossible. We will be obese, and in fact, we are obese. In Europe, we have 30% of the people at risk of obesity, and the cost to recover obesity is 6% of the total health expenditure in Europe. And imagine in Italy, the country of the Mediterranean diet, that we have a big tradition in food, the health expenditure is passing from the 15 years, from 96 to 2010, from 50 billion to more than 100 billion. And a big part of this argumentation is related to our food habits. So we are becoming obese, and we throw away 30% of the food we produce in the industrialized country or in developing country for lack of technology. Lack of technology. We have all the technology we like, but we are not able to transfer the technology to what they need. So for this, from our experience, I'm 25 years old working in the food service with small scale and large food service company. I really fully convinced that we need to establish a metric system and a kind of win-win deal, new deal, between public and private. First, to assess these metrics, because otherwise everything should be green and not green. Environmental accounting is one of the key. Energy is another one of keywords, energy consumption related to our daily meal or our school meal for our children. Of course, today we are more serving processed food into the school canteen or in the hospital, and not really raw ingredients worked with passion by chef. I mean, I'm working with the James Beard Foundation sometime, also with, in Milano for the US Pavilion at Expo. And we are really trying to demonstrate that we can produce a true good food with passion and with really good ingredients, but sometimes we use too much processed food. So we need to reduce processed food, and if we reduce processed food, we will create jobs. And jobs is one of the other key words for the needed shift of paradigm. So few key indicators we need, not so many, and we have available a lot of indicators, a lot of systems, starting from the life cycle analysis to the carbon footprint that we can use to really, in a serious way, to evaluate the environmental, the social, and economical impact of our food. Because we have not to forget that we are what we eat. So let's talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio. And I failed to mention that you're actually working with the U.S. State Department to supply all the catering of food for 6 months of the Milan Expo to the U.S. Pavilion. So it's a fascinating bridge right there between Italy and the U.S. as at the level of food supply and logistics. You've been talking a little bit privately about it, how complex it is. So we've had a lot of perspective here, and it may sound like it's just overwhelming to anyone new to this, that there's so many different perspectives and levels here. I actually have the good news to share is that all of these perspectives are part of not one, but many conversations in which all these perspectives are included, more than they ever have been before. So when I mentioned that there are cities around the world starting to share their conversations, it really does include most of the perspectives you had here. So cities asking questions about the land base of their food supply. Cities asking questions how they can integrate the investments that are being made in rural and urban food supply chains. Cities that are trying to bring together a converging of the health concerns that are practically epidemic in many parts of the world around either overnutrition or undernutrition. And it's that integrating with indicators that are useful tools to measure from a baseline of today to go forward that is actually the activity in this town right now around indicators for the new development agenda. Unfortunately, the cities themselves that are really working on these conversations aren't in those rooms, and that might change over the next few months. This is one of those situations where you have the best thinking and the best practice further away from where the decisions are being made at a global level in New York. So we don't have enough time to do the kinds of rounds of interactive questions amongst the panel because we really have a hard stop at 45 after 4. So I would like to open the floor because I think that would be the most useful and you know, to key questions a little bit, I think, you know, to address those that cut across the panel would be actually very useful, as well as to individual panelists that you want to ask more questions about. So go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm really glad that you talked about parallel investment into urban and rural food systems today. And so taking that idea into actionable steps from a policy perspective, what people who are connected to the farms, people who are connected to the markets in the cities, and researchers, what they can provide, what do our next steps look like? And if I could prong that question, do we know about how many pounds of food, for instance, we grow right now in our local food shed, and how many pounds are demanded, and then how much is lost due to that lack of labor? Could we do like cost effectiveness studies and make a case for having some of like the investment plans that you made, like how can that money go actually into labor? Because labor problems like funding for farmers, money for farmers, that's like a huge issue for this. We see farming jobs pop up into comp food jobs every day, and they have very low stipends, sometimes none. And I know I've worked in farms and a lot of hard work. And so yeah, I wanted to know some of your ideas about that. How can we make it an effective and actionable policy case about these things?
Anybody want to take that? I'm also thinking it might be a good opportunity to talk about the supply chain study as a baseline assessment for New York.
Right.
It relates to.
So, yeah, so I can start with a piece of that. That was a very, very long, multifaceted question. Steve and I were just sort of exchanging a glance because about a year ago, I started a conversation with Steve about the fact that since 2004, when the first wholesale farmers market study was completed, which was the supply and demand analysis, the demand for local food in New York City has not been re-quantified. So just to give you a little bit of a kind of idea and context about that, when we did that work, institutions like schools, hospitals, et cetera, refused to participate in the research because their response was, what are you talking about? What are you talking about, our demand for local food? We don't even understand what the question is. And manufacturers also refuse to participate. So what I know from the work we did with school food is that $15 to $20 million just for New York City school food alone could be purchased locally if there was available supply and the right relationships and mechanisms. So a year ago, I went to Steve and I said, okay, Steve, I love your food shed thing, and I'll support you. Will you support me? I really want to get this demand data updated. I have folks like the president of Baldor Foods telling me that he believes the demand has increased tenfold. Okay, well, going from $1 billion of demand to $10 billion of demand is a huge deal. That's a lot of food. Other people tell me it's increased 8 times or 20 times or 15 times. It is true that there is an exponential increase in demand for local food. I think it would serve both the city and the rural areas to really know what that number is so that farm organizations can plan with farmers what to plant, what to grow. Because it's not only what is the demand, it is not just the number, it's the type of food and how it's packaged and how it's shipped and how it's graded and what it looks like and what varieties, et cetera. So farm groups are calling me every year and saying, hey, have you ever updated that number? And I said, no, I haven't. No one wants to pay for it. And then I get buyers calling me up and saying, hey, have you ever updated that number? And I'm like, no, I'd love to update it. And it actually wouldn't even cost that much. But it's more money than I have to just sort of allocate time for my staff to do it. So without data, I mean, again, I'm in the business of data, so you would naturally think I would say this. Without data and qualities underneath that data, the qualitative information underneath the actual statistics, it's very difficult to plan, and it's very difficult to advocate, and it's very difficult to get investment. So that's my part of the answer to that.
So that's one response. It's very good. And I'm thinking about, Beth, your point that you made, I think, very strongly about advocating for a farm-centric approach to supply chains. And so I'm thinking about the question, what are the next steps? And I think Karen's responded to it from one perspective, which is the baseline data and the updating of that data on what the demand is. This makes me think of the supply side research, which I know you're doing also, Karen, but I'm thinking about, Beth, what would you say to the questioner about next steps in terms of your statement about a farm-centric approach?
And we're focusing on the policy initiatives that would make a farm-centric supply chain possible, or basically encourage that. I believe that was the question, was that what the policy initiatives would be. As you guys can probably tell today already, I'm pretty much a straight shooter. And so my real answer is, I don't know. And I'm working very, very hard to create that farm-centric supply chain in the private sector. And it's, as I indicated before, there are numerous challenges to it. I didn't plan this, but the farm I showed in the video today, Ramon's farm, lost his entire pea crop to hail. And those are, that's the nature of farming, and those are the types of problems that we have to solve. As I mentioned, labor is a consistent national problem as it relates to farming, having access to consistent labor. And that's a too large a topic to probably really go into in this panel. I don't want to get us too off topic. I'm a huge fan of on-farm infrastructure. So as I mentioned, post-harvest handling is an issue that I see as a bottleneck in my daily work when working with farms. They don't have the equipment or the labor again, or the capital to cool and handle produce properly to help ensure and keep the product fresh. I don't think access to when I started in working with running farm viability programs in upstate New York, I really thought distribution was the #1 problem. And I don't think it's actually access to distribution. I think it's access, or it's part of it, but I would add a nuance to it now. It's access to affordable distribution and efficient. During the winter, we obviously have to truck a lot of food from other places. And I want to work with small farms to get this food, and less than a trailer load reefer trucks are either very expensive, not on time, not reliable, and that's really difficult for a retailer. So distribution is a problem, but it's not that the trucks aren't there, it's that they don't work for farms. Regional Access, which is a food distribution company based outside of Ithaca, and has been delivering food, picking food directly, doing on-farm pickups, which is a bit of a rarity for food distribution, and has been doing it for about 25 years or so. It's hard to make that cost effective, but they still do it because they believe in it. So farm-friendly distribution systems would be another policy, if we could create policies that would incentivize or make it more efficient to create farm-centric distribution. And the last one is I'll use a bit of a general term, but it's one that I feel like would help me more than anything, is a really solid database of not only farms, but also these logistics carriers. There are a million different, local harvests, market maker. There's, for every different region has their own database around farms. They're rarely accurate. And I actually spent a lot of time creating these in my previous lives. And it's just, no one's really perfected that. So it is, when I need to find radishes from New Jersey, that's not an efficient process to go through. And if there was some more information infrastructure, which would be so easy to fix, that would make retailers like myself be able to find farms more quickly and easier. So I don't know if I actually mentioned any policies in there, but I hope that hope that helps.
Well, I can maybe fill in a little bit about that. So farm-centric supply chain. Tomorrow, if anybody's going to be here tomorrow, Eric Goldstein, who is the head of New York City School Food, he'll be here. I'd like you to ask him what he thinks about farm-centric supply chain. Because if you think New York City schools is 1 million kids, 900,000 meals a day, and there are so many USDA regulations, nutrition specs, et cetera, that have to do with that. But I will tell you one way that they do that. So they're not going to say, we're going to create our menu around what's available seasonally. They'll just never do that because there's so many other things that come into play. But one piece that does happen within that is when there has been and now still is a mindset about buying more local food. I'll give you an example of a plum. We said we grow lots of plums in New York State. They don't have enough markets. Okay, let's replace the California plum with a New York plum. New York State grows a certain kind of plum. California grows another kind of plum. It was a big deal at the time, but once it was done the first time, it didn't have to be a big deal anymore. They modified the specification for plums to be from the California variety, which I can't put my mind on the name of at the moment, but you know, that round purple plum that you get, to the New York State plums that are more like the prune plums, right? And the specification was not just, okay, we'll buy this plum instead of this plum. That plum in California has been perfectly designed to be a 2.5 ounce portion of fruit, which is what kids are required to get in school. And the New York State plums are too small for that. So the specification had to be for 2 New York State plums, which was 2.75 ounces of fruit, which is fine to give kids more fruit, but it meant that something else on the menu had to adjust to accommodate for that 1/4 ounce extra fruit that was coming from the 2 plum portion. So it's a kind of a farm-centric thing done through the power of the purchase order and the power of the food specification.
Yeah, that's a great example.
But it's not crazy because you could actually do it. Yeah.
Something I've been, I agree that, those are things that are so simple, if you just step back and rethink them. And at Blue Apron, we've been really, I've been able to get them to, rather than putting, one bunch of or putting like 3 red beets on a menu, for our customers, change it to a bunch of beets. So that means depending on what size the beets come in from the farm, we can give the customer 3, 4, et cetera. We have to keep our eye on cooking times because we are a culinary business. But it's like this thinking is so simple, but I feel like there's still so much room for innovation.
So I just want to jump in and go back to the question in which, to me, the sort of, no, not that you weren't addressing
Why
it.
not? Why not?
No, you were addressing it, but the fact that it was such a big question to me is symptomatic and reflective of the nature of what we're talking about. And while Beth is a jaded optimist. I'm a cautious optimist. And from the perspective of, the summer before last, before Mayor de Blasio was elected in this very room, for the first time, there was a mayor's candidate forum on food issues. And 1,000 people came to that. The fact that this task force exists, the fact that these questions are being asked, the fact that this group is here today, I'm very optimistic from that perspective, as immense as the challenges are, that 5 years from now, we're going to be in a much better place on all of these issues. I don't think we have the data. I don't think we have the systems in place yet to be systematic about how we get there. And I don't think our economy lends itself to being too systematic anyway. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to be making a tremendous amount of progress because of the immense public interest that's being shown at the public policy level and by average people.
Steve, you've done a great job in kind of pulling together and wrapping up this, actually, because if we had a long line of questioners, I would have a harder time doing this. But unfortunately, we do have to bring this to a close. As you can tell, and as the last panel also, it was clear that there could be days of conversation here. And there will be more conversation, and tomorrow, some of this will continue on the Power of the Public panel at 11. So I hope many of you will be here for tomorrow's schedule. I want to thank the panelists for a really enlightening conversation.